Second in the lineup is the group that's been working with the environmental advocates under Kizzy Charles-Guzman as their faculty advisor.
Hi everyone, I'm Annabelle Gibson and I'm going to be talking to you on behalf of our capstone group. As just mentioned, our work has been focused on advancing zero waste in New York State through the use of reusable containers. So New York State produces over 17 million tons of municipal waste every year, and packaging waste is about a quarter of that. So nearly 4 million tons of packaging waste every year, and a chunk of that comes from reusable foodware. So cups, utensils, bowls, and whilst they might make sense for the business to purchase at the outset, they're cheap. The lasting implications in terms of waste, emissions, and economic cost are substantial. So the fairly obvious solution, you might say, is to replace these disposable containers with reusable ones, and you'd be right. It's a matter of how you implement that solution, and one such solution is BYOC, or bring your own container, whereby a customer is permitted to bring their own clean container for their doggy bag or their takeaway, and this has the impact of reducing packaging waste without requiring a business to overhaul its whole operations to do so. Unfortunately, at the moment, there's legal ambiguity around liability and just a general lack of support, which means that very few businesses actually do offer this. And where they do offer it, often customers just don't know it exists, so they don't bring their own bowl. The policy landscape is evolving around this. There is a bill in committee at the moment called the Right to Refill, which would permit just that. But whilst the intent of the bill is there are some actions required in order to A, successfully pass the bill, and B, once it's passed, how do you successfully implement it and then ensure that this implementation really does last? It exists in perpetuity. And as I mentioned, there is that legal ambiguity. There's a lack of standardized procedures. There's no community outreach. So these challenges are being worked on at the moment by various organizations, including nonprofits, one of which is our client, Environmental Advocates New York. Based in Albany, their work really sits at that intersection between advocacy and education and community engagement. And they have the overall objective of safeguarding New York State's environmental landscape, but also public health. And so as part of their work on waste, we were engaged to firstly assess the policy as it stands, and then look at the context in New York State. Does it work? Does it not? How do you make it work? And then more widely look at the research or where this has been done previously. So when we started to approach this task, we really framed our research in three buckets, three key questions. The first was around feasibility. Is this viable from an operational and economic standpoint? The next was around adoption. Will customers and businesses do this? And then lastly, around public benefit. So zooming out, what is the public benefit to New York State for a BYOC solution? And to answer these questions, we took a fairly holistic approach for our methodology, starting off with a risk assessment. We then did a legal and regulatory context mapping, both within New York State and comparing to others. We did a full cost-benefit analysis. We looked at numerous case studies, over 30 case studies, which we then whittled down to 11 key case studies. And we spoke to over 140 voices, and that was everyone from customers to NGOs to the food service establishments themselves in the form of surveys or in-person interviews predominantly. The good news is that we found support across all of these stakeholder groups. The crux of it is that the support that they give is dependent on them receiving the right support. And I just want to take a bit of time to spend on the key challenge, shall we say, that sits across these three buckets that you see on the slide. And that's really around that liability protection and safety concerns. And just taking a step back, where does that come from? Essentially, when a customer brings their own bowl to a food service establishment, they are responsible for the cleanliness. And so if it's not clean and it contaminates their food, they could get sick. But there is a real risk that it also contaminates the establishment itself through coming into contact with the surfaces or the utensils, and then that creates a really quite large problem for that business. So the concern is really valid, so much so that a lot of the businesses that we spoke to who don't currently offer it said that this was the reason that they wouldn't. They're just not willing to take the risk. Again, the good news is that 83% of the businesses that don't currently do it said that they would be willing to do so if they had that guidance and their needs met with respect to signage and materials that would help them. And then on the customer side, 87% of customers said that they would adopt a BYOC solution, with 73% saying they'd be more likely to do so if there were small incentives offered. So coming into the cost-benefit analysis, and this really did provide us with so many useful insights and research avenues, so please do feel free to ask a little bit more about it. But the spark notes, in the interest of time, is that this is economically feasible for a business. If over a 5-year period, even just 15% of customers bringing their own bowl, the benefits outweigh the costs of implementing this solution by 2.65 times. Zooming out to the state level, this is where the numbers really hit home for us in particular. Looking at the environmental impact of that same 15% adoption rate, so really not a huge shift here, that gets you to 500 million containers avoided each year, which is the equivalent of 16,000 tons of waste diverted from landfill. Putting that into an emissions perspective, it's the equivalent of taking 9,000 cars off the road in that year. Notwithstanding these environmental benefits, looking at the economics as well, from a state perspective, just the waste haulage and tipping fees that they would normally spend, it would save them about $3 million a year. And then that wider public benefit that you're getting from this, it's a net benefit as well, gets you to over 400 million across the state over 5 years. So now that we know it's possible and the benefits, how do we recommend actually doing it to A, get that passage, and B, that successful implementation? And it's really in these 3 levers that you see on the slide. The first is around legal clarity that I've touched on before. It's ensuring those health codes explicitly mention BYOC. It's defining those cleanliness terms. It's all about that liability protection for businesses as far as you are able to do so. The next is around coordinated oversight. This is obviously going to involve collaboration between a lot of different agencies within the state. We don't envisage the workload being significantly more, but it's about how do you get it embedded in those existing procedures. Lastly, it's around business and public support. So for the businesses in particular, we've developed a comprehensive business toolkit to really give businesses the tools that to make them feel able to do safely BYOC procedures and without any confusion. There's FAQs in there. There's an explanation of the bill in layman's terms. It really does give them, we think, everything they need. Another thing to consider here is around equity. So this can take the form of ensuring that the signage is both non-digital and digital, but also down the line, looking at low-income households where it may not be feasible to purchase these containers, consideration of a subsidized container distribution program. Lastly on this, it's the collaboration with NGOs and those people that are going to be doing that troubleshooting on the ground and that community outreach that they already do so well. So just taking one more step back as the key takeaways here, I think it's really important to remember that the waste problem in New York State isn't just about litter. It's a systemic challenge to do with petrochemical reliance and plastics pollution and emissions, and BYOC really is a low-cost, high-impact tool that delivers the results. In the words of E&Y, our client, this is the simplest way to start a reuse culture in New York State. And we believe that the tools that we've developed and provided as a group really do support that. Thank you very much.
How does this BYOC plan take into account the millions of tourists that come every year? And from a practicality standpoint, does it make sense for them to bring plastic containers along?
Yeah, it's a fair challenge. I think the benefit of this bill is that we're really trying to build the culture within New York State. And whilst, yes, it is difficult for tourists to adopt it, it is a voluntary mechanism for people to do it. The bill is really ensuring that businesses offer it where people want to engage with it. And I think what we haven't touched on here is we did a lot of work around the next steps for reuse culture in New York State. So BYOC, whilst yes, tourists might not be able to engage with it, as I mentioned, that 15% adoption, even that drives such big results. And to get to that next step, we did quite a lot of research into a future opportunity, which would be a return and reuse system whereby the businesses lead that container distribution and then they can drop it back by a disposal bin, a return bin, or with the restaurant or food service establishment themselves. But it's a fair point. Unfortunately, I don't think tourists will be able to engage that well unless they brought their Tupperware on holiday.
Excellent presentation. On the cost-benefit analysis, you mentioned it provided a lot of insights. I know you touched on a few of them. Can you speak more on that?
Sure. Let me just jump to... Okay, so there's a lot of numbers on the screen, but I'll sort of distill it for you, and this actually leads on very nicely from the previous question, so thank you. I think what was coming out of our initial planning and research when we were looking into the academic studies, that there's a few mechanisms that you can do reuse culture. One of them is a BYOC model, and the other is a return and reuse model. And so what we wanted to do was ensure that we weren't just looking at the economics and feasibility as regards to BYOC. We wanted to give our client the best solution that there is available. So we wanted to compare it to a return and reuse model. And just drawing your eye to a couple of the lines here, the first is on that break-even period. And as I mentioned before, the BYOC model sort of pays for itself almost immediately. The interesting thing that we found for a return and reuse model, the numbers are a lot bigger. I'll just go on to the next slide actually to show you this. The numbers are a lot bigger, but the payback period is much longer. So that really spoke to us in terms of splitting out the benefits of the two models into what should be doing now and what does a future look like, because the potential for the environmental impacts and economic impacts are huge down the line. But as you can see on the chart, there's a lot of factors that feed in, and because of the complexity, because customers might not bring back the container, because people are lazy, right? Like you need to make it easy for them to bring the bowl back, otherwise they'll just pay the $5 for the bowl and they'll throw it away. So there's a lot of factors that feed into this, but those I thought were the most interesting insights coming out of it outside of what I presented.
I love that last slide with the dishwasher on it. Yeah, because to me, I think it's like, the problem is who's going to do the dishes. Mm-hmm. You're taking away something that usually the restaurant is doing for you, or you're not doing it by throwing it away. I think something I always thought was the right solution to this problem is to just make it easy to wash dishes without perhaps needing a full-time employee or reworking the plumbing in the restaurant or the landscape. So I'm curious if you saw any technology that would allow, for example, fast casual businesses with very clearly defined bowls, let's say, to like speed run those dishes and then just allow places that are currently generating tons and tons of trash to just switch to a dishwasher model.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And again, it comes down to, I'll flick briefly to another slide, but again, when this return and reuse model becomes more applicable, you do need that washing infrastructure, as you just said. I don't know so much about technology. There is obviously Just Salad in New York who's been doing something like this for a while, and they have industrial washing machines. But what was an interesting takeaway from further afield in other states and abroad was some of the places that were doing this successfully had centralized washing systems, which were either run by third parties or in some cases the state had they'd acquired enough bowls to be the lead distributor of those bowls. And so the centralized washing systems became the best system, so, to your point, so that businesses, again, don't have to go through the overhauling of their operations. They don't have to spend loads more time washing dishes, etc. So I don't know about technology, but that was an interesting system that we came across.